Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another edition of Hilaal Live. I'm your host, Luqman Shadrack, all the way from our Cape Town studios. Now, it's coming up to wedding season. We call it wedding season in Cape Town, where the weather's getting a bit warmer, so a lot more weddings take place. But, one needs to look at the parameters and guidelines that you need to, take into consideration, especially those couples getting married. Around the legalities of marriage in South Africa. I thought, let's invite we have had him in studio before to give us some much needed legal advice. Brother Whalied Said, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You as well as all the viewers out there.
Jazakallah so much for coming into studio. I know this is your daily operation dealing with marriages, couples, the
Correct.
legalities, but more importantly, the guidelines around the matrimonial, maybe the property regime. When couples enter into marriage, inevitably, some of them have property, have assets. So before we get into that, into the legalities of that, maybe set the tone and give our audience a bit of background around South Africa's legal framework on marriages.
Okay, so South African law regarding marriages is governed by essentially three acts. One being the Marriage Act, there's also the Civil Unions Act, and then also the Customary Marriages Act, dealing with customary marriages. Those were essentially the three main pieces of legislation that dealt with marriage itself, and then there's ancillary legislation, for example, the Divorce Act, the Matrimonial Property Act, that deals with consequences of marriage, for example. And, I'm glad that we're here speaking about this, because one often never gets enough time to speak about these issues. And in terms of setting the tone, I think my biggest gripe in terms of when it comes to marriage and marriage regimes and things like that is that people are so in love going into wedding season and marriage season, they don't think about these things until it's too late.
Invariably, you find that people have gone through a divorce, and sometimes it can be a bit complicated with regards to the ex-spouse now entering into a new marriage. They need to take certain things into consideration so that it won't be a problem for the new marriage. And largely amount, people tend to forget about it.
Correct.
Okay. So why is it so important, Whalied, for couples to understand the legal framework of marriage before actually tying the knot?
As you mentioned a minute ago, for example, when you're sitting with a divorced couple that's now re-entering into marriage, or even a widowed person, right? More often than not, they're going into that marriage with certain assets and certain liabilities already attached to them. There may be kids that would be entitled to those assets. And when you're entering into that marriage and you're not doing it correctly, it could have dire consequences for your assets and for the legacy that you might have wanted to leave for your children. And that is why it's so important to seek advice on these issues, so that you understand, especially with all the hustle and bustle and hype that is currently surrounding the so-called, and I put that in inverted commas because it's so-called recognition of Muslim marriages. We'll chat about that again. But if you follow the hype and you don't follow proper legal advice, you will end up being married in community of property and potentially lose half of your assets without meaning to do that.
I think that's where a lot of people tend to not fully understand the legalities around entering into a new union. Do you think enough has been done, or do you feel that we should spend a lot more time like at marriage classes, and this should be part of the discussion prior to getting married?
Definitely, I think so. There's always been a lot done in terms of educating people around your Islamic and Sharia obligations and rights in terms of marriage. But as time has passed, there's become a greater importance and a greater emphasis has been placed on recognition of Muslim marriages within the South African law context. And what's happened over the years is that we've been forced to go into civil marriages so that we can have a Home Affairs marriage certificate, for example, because what you find now is, especially with the younger generation, you find a lot of them immigrating, working in the UAE, working in
Yes.
Saudi, working all over. And for those types of jobs, you need recognized marriage certificates. And so they go off and they get married at Home Affairs because they need a marriage certificate, but not necessarily something that would be of proper benefit to them, or not necessarily, and more importantly, for especially for this audience, something that is Sharia compliant.
Yeah. So prior to entering into an anti-nuptial contract, for example, would it be advisable to have a contract drawn up so that there are no debt carried over, or to protect the spouse?
Look, that's the essence of an anti-nuptial contract. It protects a spouse from those types of things, right? What one can also do is, I've on many occasions drafted Muslim marriage contracts for couples, because those terms and those obligations and rights are not covered in an anti-nuptial contract.
I see.
An anti-nuptial contract protects you legally within the South African legal framework. Everything else, you can and should have a separate contract for that.
Okay. Good question, and good, advice around that as well. So if you look at the legal developments surrounding, we spoke about the property regimes, and let's take into where you mentioned Muslim marriages in general. What are those legal developments?
So the current hype over the last week or two has been around the recognition, and again in inverted commas, of Muslim marriages, which has been pushed by the Minister of Home Affairs with the registration of the nikah certificate.
Right.
And that's currently the sort of the hype, but it's not. It's a lot deeper than that, because that, once you delve into it, you'll understand is just superficial recognition and not actual recognition of Muslim marriages. Then at the same time, there's also been earlier this year, I think it was around in May, there was certain amendments done to the Divorce Act, which recognizes, amongst others, the rights of Muslim, well, men and women for that matter, who was married in terms of Muslim law only, but there now appears to be an unfair distribution of assets. So the court is now authorized to look at a Muslim marriage where there was an unfair distribution of assets, because the common question that people come up with all the time is that, but what if the wife was at home and the husband was working and he put all the assets on his name, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, that in itself is not Sharia compliant, but purely from a South African law perspective, the amended Divorce Act now caters for that. Right? It doesn't take away out of community of property. It just creates a little sector where, if there's unfairness within the law or within the marriage, then that unfairness can be redressed by the court, obviously after evidence has been laid and a proper case has been made out.
Taking that into consideration, what are some of the common mistakes that people make when entering into a marriage and not taking the property regime into consideration?
I think the biggest mistake people make is not taking advice on what is best for them in their circumstances. And, the funny thing is, over the last week, while we've been preparing for this, for example, I've had some funny comments on my social media posts, for example, because I've got a couple of posts dealing with marriage. And one of the comments, for example, was, to do an anti-nuptial contract is expensive. I did a sarcastic reply to it, just to give some context in terms of, it's not an expense, it's an investment. Right. Another person said that, I didn't do an anti-nuptial contract because it's just too much work, so I just got married in community because I didn't have to do anything. So no consideration for the consequences. Another person said, what, this is just, you guys just copy and paste and you charge us. Obviously, no idea what goes on behind registering an anti-nuptial contract and the advice that you need to do, the advice that you need to give. So I think the biggest mistake is people making assumptions about what's right, what's not right, what's good for them, and not taking advice until it's too late.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think a series like this, and we're going to unpack this over the next couple of weeks. First of all, the property regimes, and looking at other, pertinent information that gets overlooked sometime.
Definitely.
When it comes to entering into a marriage. What you can do, our dear viewer, is send me an email, lukman@hilaal.tv. And if you have any questions, we'll pose it to Whalied and we can always answer that in the next episode before we carry on with the info on the day as well. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we chat a bit more to our attorney in studio. Do stay tuned to Hilaal Live. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Hilaal Live. Thanks for watching us on channel 347 on DSTV. We have Whalied Said in studio, attorney, discussing matrimonial property regimes and valuable information. You are thinking about tying the knot, things to consider before you do so. Whalied, jazakallah so much for coming into studio and educating us and sharing your wisdom with regards to this valuable topic. Now, for those that are entering into marriage, maybe can you run through and explain to us what is some of the common or what is the differences, my apologies, between, I think you have a civil, I think you've got religious and customary marriages in South Africa. And how did these, create an impact when one is getting married?
Okay, so I think from the perspective of Muslims, you probably got a vast majority Muslim audience viewership, and historically we've always done religious marriage, and that is been obviously the sore topic in terms of not being recognized. But we've always just entered into what is called a religious marriage, and that is we go to the mosque and we perform a nikah with the imam, and that has been fine. Now, within the South African context, there are certain areas where that is recognized. For example, in deceased estates, they recognize the spouse of a deceased person with a nikah certificate, right? Then you also get a civil marriage, and that is where your marriage actually gets registered by Home Affairs. Now, in the past, and if you wanted to, for example, change your surname, they would sometimes insist that you need a civil marriage certificate, and then you'd need to so in the past, you'd go to the people who'd say, we're going to get married in court, or we're going to get married at Home Affairs. Nowadays, there is quite a number of shuyukh that has been trained and registered as marriage officers, and they can actually perform that civil marriage with your nikah as well. Right? Customary marriages doesn't really apply to us as Muslims, because those are more your traditional Zulu and all the different African cultures, Khoza, that they also have their own religious / cultural marriages, and those fall under the Customary Union Act.
Okay.
Right. So from our perspective, it's a choice between, well, it's not a choice. We have to do a nikah, and then we've got a choice of entering into a civil marriage if it's needed for business or professional reasons, you're immigrating or whatever, and you need a marriage certificate. Right. Obviously, there's now the latest development is the ability to register your nikah certificate. But with that, and we're going to deal with that in one of the later episodes, is one has to be careful in terms of how you go about registering either your nikah certificate or performing a civil marriage, because within a civil marriage, there's different types of civil marriages as well, and that is where your marriage in community of property comes in. Okay. Your marriage out of community of property, and within out of community of property, you've got two subsets, one being with what is called accrual and one without accrual. Now, without being cruel. Without being cruel. There we go. Yeah. Yeah. So the marriage out of community of property and without accrual, that is the one regarded by the vast majority of ulama to be in line with, or closest in line with Sharia. Okay. And you'll find that majority of imams that are marriage officers as well won't perform a civil marriage without an antenuptial contract, because they don't want to put someone in what they would deem to be in a haram situation where you're married in community of property.
So let's look at anti-nuptial contracts, right? And especially, with accrual and without accrual as well. How does this affect us as Muslims? I mean, what are the parameters that we need to keep in mind should we put those contracts into place?
I think the biggest impact, in my opinion, would be that if you're getting married in terms of civil law and you're getting married in community of property, it's nice, and the thought of everybody sharing equally is a nice thought. But when you look at the legal ramifications of it, and especially on an estate, right, where inheritance is one of the strictest things in the
Yes.
Quran. It's one of the few things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we've spoken about this before in previous episodes, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically outlines inheritance in the Quran, as opposed to many other things which we were taught by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? So when you get married in community of property, you're directly contradicting what is being said in the Quran in terms of what I'm entitled to. So as if I'm a surviving spouse, as a male, I'm entitled to 25% of my wife's estate.
Right.
But if I'm married in community of property, automatically I'm entitled to 50% of her estate, plus then I still get my 25%
Gotcha.
from the inheritance, which is obviously way different to what I'm supposed to get. And now you're starting to cross the lines of what is halal and haram in terms of income, as well as crossing the lines of, am I usurping the inheritance of my children?
Of course. Wow. It can get quite technical there as well. So, I mean, your advice, and I would imagine people phone you up all the time, or, book an appointment with you to find out about all these parameters, all about the legalities surrounding this as well. I mean, this is good advice. Go and visit a lawyer like yourself and have a chat, speak about what's concerning you and how to better move forward. What do you take me to a typical conversation you would have between one or the couple that come to see you?
So a typical consultation would involve people seeking clarity on in community, out of community, and then majority would lean obviously towards out of community of property, and then they would ask about accrual, non-accrual, right? So from a Sharia perspective, we always advise that without accrual is preferent for a Muslim couple. Now, I think where the misunderstanding comes from is that even if you're getting married out of community of property and my assets is my assets and your wife's assets and my wife's assets is her assets, it doesn't mean we can't do things together.
Right.
It doesn't mean we can't share in a property and invest together and do things together and save together. You can still do that. You can still, you're supposed to.
Yeah.
You're supposed to do things together. You're supposed to help each other and look after each other.
Of course.
But you're still protecting your assets, especially if you're coming from a state where you were widowed or where you were previously married and you've got kids and you want to protect their rights. Then you don't want to end up in a situation, and I'm sure many people can share stories of a friend or a family member that got married and then suddenly lost half of their assets because a year later they got divorced. And it's worse in the case of a woman who got married to some guy and now he's running away with half of her assets. It's terrible. And that is why I always stress that people need to take advice. I think as a community, in general, as a Muslim community, we tend to be more reactive. And reactive is expensive. People, no, I'm going to spend 5,000 Rand to see an attorney. I mean, most attorneys doesn't even charge 5,000 Rand for a consultation like this.
Yeah.
But just think of what you spend at your wedding.
True. Also true.
On little things that you put on the table that means nothing.
That's another episode we'll have on its own. Just, the centerpiece. Always.
Absolutely, yeah.
We make light of this, but, we are very serious about providing information to
Correct.
people
Yeah.
so that they can protect themselves, their family, their loved ones. Very, very important. So what's your advice? I mean, people entering into a marriage, let's run through very quickly some of the things they need to consider.
Well, the first decision they need to make is, are we simply going to only perform a religious marriage, and that is do a nikah? And that's fine. Within the current context of South African law, only having a nikah is still fine, right? The fact that it's not registered by South African law or so-called recognized by South African law, it's not the end of the world. No one's been suffering yet. Yes, there are cases where there's been injustices done, and those have been dealt with. They're going to court. But for the vast majority of us, it's not the end of the world. We can still get away with that, right? If there's a need for a civil marriage, my advice, and this is obviously my personal advice in line with Sharia, is that you need to consider doing an antenuptial contract.
Okay.
Without accrual, right? Whether it's for business reasons or for travel reasons, whatever the case is. But the bottom line, and the easiest advice that I can give that I hope the viewers will remember is book a consultation with your attorney and get proper advice, because as much as I can say here, do this and do that, That's general advice on best circumstances in most cases. But each person might have their own peculiar circumstances.
Absolutely.
And you need to be able to explain that so that you can get the best advice.
Yeah, we don't want to end up in a situation where, you both find that you don't have a solution about any challenge or problem that you experienced in the marriage.
Correct.
And just in, peace of mind. That's what it's about as well. Waleed, shukr so much for coming into studio. I think it's been really educational. I think lots for our audience to think about. How do people get hold of you? Is there an email address, website?
There's an email address, info@sayyidattorneys.co.za. We've got a website as well, sayyidattorneys.co.za. That's SAID. I think it is on the screen now. There's a telephone number, 021-823-7862. So they can call, email, we can advise.
Yeah, and book a consultation.
And book a consultation.
Brilliant.
Inshallah.
Have a wonderful evening. Jazakallah. We look forward to the next episode. Assalamu alaikum.
I look forward to it as well. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
There we go. Attorney Whalied Said in studio, giving us valuable advice. If you are thinking about getting married, if you're entering into a union, some of the things that you need to take into consideration. That's all that we have from the Cape Town team. We're back tomorrow between 7 and 7:30, inshallah. Do stay tuned as Hilaal TV continues for the evening. From all of us in Cape Town, Sohail Barnes, Mohammed Parker, and myself, Luqman Shadrack. Have a great evening. Assalamu alaikum.